All right, we're back. Thank you for joining us again. It's 22 minutes after the hour. I'm delighted to welcome Ted Mitchell, who is the Undersecretary of Education at the U.S. Department of Education. Undersecretary Mitchell, thank you for joining us.
Casey, thank you for me. Good to see you.
Really nice to have you here. My guess is that you are all over the place at this event.
It's been a busy couple of days, and as it should be. This is an exciting group thinking about exciting things.
Okay. So I want to frame this conversation with you as I did for Susan Furman a couple moments ago. And I want to refer to Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was part of a study group, others have heard it, in the wake of the Coleman Report, looking at inequality in education, the assumption common at the time, systems thinking. All we got to do is pour a lot of resources and simple input, throughput, outputs, things are going to get better. And Moynihan says things in education are far more complicated than we thought. The rather simple, naive input-output relations, which we know naively, no doubt assumed, but honestly would work in education, don't. This is 1971 congressional hearing. We know a lot about education. You were the dean of an ed school, you've been a college president, your other parts of your career, the research you've done. All of us know a lot about education, but there's this chasm between the evidence as opposed to opinion and epiphany and if you will, the gumbo or the black box of public policy. How do we do better? Simple question to start.
Well, we'll get that one right out of the way. So I think that the idea that there's a linear production function in education has been disproven pretty roundly. And I think the root of the problem in thinking about it as a production function is that these are systemic enterprises, and they're systems within systems within systems.
And they have huge numbers of moving parts.
Huge numbers of moving parts, and the interplay is dynamic and changes over time. So think about, and Moynihan was critical in pointing this out, think about the interplay between family dynamic and family structure and family processes, neighborhoods, neighborhood structure, and then schools. And then once you get inside schools, think about the social system that is the teacher. And you and Susan probably talked about that, but then you introduce all of the things about teachers. Where do they come from? How old are they? How closely related has been their experience been to the experience of their students? So each of those is a very dynamic, oftentimes contentious set of relationships across the system. And creating some kind of linear modeling around that is still always going to fail.
But on the outside, the complaint that I suspect you hear in the department, that I hear as a civilian and somebody who watches a lot of this stuff for both K-12 and higher ed, is that the outside world works on a linear model.
That's right.
And it's a model like highway construction. So you drive down the interstate, they repave the damn thing, and your highway dollars at work, and you can see capital improvement. And yet, all the money that goes to education, if you're an advocate or agnostic or antagonistic about how that's being done and the sums involved, the linear assumptions, we gave you all this money, why aren't test scores up? Why can't students at whatever level do certain things? Why don't teachers do these things? Is this just a failure to communicate?
I think it partly is a failure to communicate. I think it's partly a misunderstanding of the way human systems change and evolve. And so let's take your highway analogy, which I think is a good one. There's a sense that you start at point A, you do B, C, D, and E, and F, and you end up at G. I think what we're learning, certainly about education, is that there are basically two problems in that model. One is people look across that spectrum of variables and say, aha, that's the one that we need to fix. And so we'll put resources into that one variable, teacher training as an example. We're going to fix teacher training and everything else goes away. It's the classic silver bullet that we talk about.
Financial aid's a good example of that. We'll give students money to go to college, not looking at any of their infrastructure issues about preparation, support, sustainability.
That's right. And so that idea of a single point solution is problematic and always going to fail because these are systemic issues. The second is that we like to believe, even in human systems, that when you address a problem, it stays fixed. And because of the dynamic interplay of all of these variables, it's not so much about fixing a problem as it is iterating around it and keeping eyes on what's going on so that one can be flexible and continue to iterate. I think that as we look at change management, and I'm no expert in change management, but I've talked to a lot of people who are, we're moving from this idea of a linear model, a kind of waterfall, first do this, then do this, then do this, and then you'll be done, to one that is much more agile, much more about iteration, much more about evidence, much more about gathering data and refining practice. And I think that whether it's in higher ed or in K-12, that approach has some real promise.
Let's talk about data. We are in the era of big data. Schools, states, universities, the federal government through NCES, the National Center for Education Statistics, amass a lot of data. This is a conversation because of its tech industry roots. It's very focused on metrics. What works.
That's right.
Figure out a couple of regression analysis, and we get it. It's just right there on the whiteboard, or it's sitting on screen in front of us. And yet, there's a cup-to-lip experience to a lot of this. If we may not have the right data. We may have the right data. We're asking the wrong questions. We've got the right answers, but how do we move that cup-to-lip issue in terms of dealing with the other moving parts, which are people, which are culture, policy? Does the data, are we getting smarter about data as opposed to just having a lot of data?
I think we are getting smarter about data. I point to a couple of things. You know that over the last couple of years, the department has worked hard to use data from our own sources, data from the IRS, to create a consumer-facing tool that would allow students and families and school counselors and others access to information about variables that matter in the college experience. And this is not to draw direct conclusions. It's data that we want to make available to consumers who can then ask their own questions about the data. So for some students, the diversity of the student body may be very important, and so we want students to be able to have good, reliable data about that metric. Others, perhaps parents, will be interested in earnings outcomes, and so we want those data to be available too. I think that what we're learning in data science is that making the data available, creating tools to slice and dice the data in a variety of different ways is far better than coming up with a set of data, drawing conclusions and saying, here, because of these data, we now know X, Y, or Z. So that open data, transparency of data, in addition to being a very useful tool for decision making, is, we think, a responsible approach to government. So we're going to work as hard as we can over the next 270 days to make sure that we continue to make data available.
I'm sorry, you seem to know that day count quite precisely.
I have an app. I have an app for that.
Yeah, all right. But the other part of the data question for me is the culture of data. Not as a consumer, as a student, as a parent, but as an education professional. And there's a long history of data being used as a weapon as opposed to a resource, both in K-12 and higher ed. And taking a single data point as being definitive as opposed to being marginally informative, you need the larger narrative. We don't necessarily do a good job of training education professionals about how to understand data. We don't build trust around data as a mechanism of currency. And operationally in organizations, again, I want to draw on your experience as a president as well as being a dean of an ed school at UCLA where we first met. How do we change that culture? Is that a matter of a great leader coming in and just by dicta and by force of will? Or how does that trickle through that we actually begin to do the right thing and sort of embed what others would call a commitment to continuous quality improvement? How do we do better with data culture?
So I think it's a great question, and there isn't a single or simple answer. I think that there are different models by which organizations become more data literate, and I'll give you a couple. So one, lots of folks who are here in San Diego this week are working on adaptive learning technologies, whether that's for K-12 or for higher ed. And what those adaptive learning technologies do is they direct, they amass an awful lot of data, whether it's screen clicks or answers to questions, the pace at which students move through work. All of those data then become a part of a dashboard that a teacher looks at to answer the question, what should I be putting in front of Ted today that will help him make up for deficiencies that are identified by the data? Well, fine, except for the exact point that you make, is that teachers need to be far more data savvy than most teachers are today. And we need to incorporate that kind of data savvy into the basic toolkit for teachers. And so teacher training programs increasingly are making the use of data an important anchor for the training that they're providing to their students. And I think it's essential. It's essential to be able to use the data as a tool and not a weapon, as you say. Can I do one more?
Sure, absolutely.
Higher ed, the use of predictive analytics at a number of institutions. Secretary King and I were at Georgia State in Atlanta a couple of weeks ago.
They have a great story to tell.
They have a great story to tell, and their story is one that's driven by leadership. So new leadership comes in, dedicated to using data to making decisions institutionally, but also to helping students make good decisions. They go back and mine 10 years worth of data about student course taking patterns, for example. They identify for different pathways to a degree, to different majors, critical nodes, juncture points, where if students don't do well in a particular course, they're likely not going to succeed. Why do they know that? Because the massive data says that this is a gateway course for nursing, for whatever the other program. So by being able to identify that, then they're able to dedicate advising resources to students in a way that helps them make progress where progress is most needed to stay on the path to their degree. And if, for example, a student chooses a course that is a suboptimal course, advisors are able to intervene and help students make a good choice.
Well, I'll go a step further in terms of giving props to Georgia State, rather. My apologies to the folks in Georgia. My understanding is they've effectively eliminated the gaps historically that differentiate white students, black students, and students of color.
And first generation.
And first generation. That's an amazing and a humongous achievement in a very short period of time that could not be done with an epiphany.
That's right.
Had to be driven by data.
Data followed up by good, hard budget decisions
Right.
to be able to build an infrastructure that could use that data, create some great change management programs that help the faculty understand their role, a new advising corps understand and deploy against their responsibilities, and to do what we need to do, which is to solve this completion problem that is keeping first generation, low income and minority students from walking across that graduation stage.
I want to be mindful, you opened the door with the 270 days, but I want to talk about the preceding roughly 2,000 days. And while these conversations are not intended to be an infomercial, I want to respectfully offer you the opportunity. What do you think are the top 3 or 4 achievements of the current administration? You are admittedly an administration appointee in your role as undersecretary. What would you point to, prior to your arrival as part of your presence, and when you leave in those 270 days and counting down? The best of what's been done under this leadership.
Yeah, so we're not taking victory laps.
I understand you're not done yet. You got 270 days to go.
And this has been an incredible team effort from day one. I'm going to focus on higher ed because that's the area where I work most closely. But having said that, I think that whether it's higher ed or K-12, this administration has done a fantastic job in a number of areas. First and foremost, it has focused the attention of the nation on outcomes. And that's critically important. Going back to the very first question, we can fiddle around all we want about inputs, but unless we're measuring outcomes, we're going to miss the mark. Second, from pre-K through collegiate education, this administration has been laser focused on making equity a high priority, the highest priority. We believe that education, as Horace Mann said a long time ago, is the balance wheel of society, and that our education system in the United States must live up to our highest aspirations for ourselves as a nation of equality, a nation of democracy, a nation of laws. And the equity piece of that is absolutely critical. In higher ed, the president has made unprecedented commitments by increasing the number of Pell Grants, by increasing the size of Pell Grants, trying to keep college affordable. The president, by creating the direct student loan program, moved $60 billion out of the hands of middlemen and back into expenditures for students.
End of the role of essentially direct lending.
Direct lending,
right.
Direct lending, taking banks out of the equation. Those have been tremendous achievements on the front end to make college affordable. On the just access to financial aid, the simplification of the FAFSA form has been a remarkable innovation, and we'll continue with that this fall, as families will be able to use automatically generated income data to fill out the form, and the form will be available in October, not January. That'll allow families to make choices about colleges with a firm understanding of their eligibility for financial aid. We've moved the ball a lot in terms of affordability and access to funds. At the back end, we all know that because of state disinvestment in higher education, tuition prices are going up at the very time when families are feeling most stretched, and in particular, low-income families. So the burden is getting heavier for those who can afford to bear it the least, and so they're borrowing more money.
But honestly, I mean, I think what's lost in a lot of the public conversation about this is more the activities of the states.
That's right.
The fact is that in many states, funding has been whacked. In some states, it's almost been zeroed out. Colorado, Arizona, I believe, are down to about 5%. Michigan down to 10. I know when UCLA calls and they want to stick their hand in my wallet as an alum, they tell me the state funding is down to about 10 or 12% from orders of magnitude higher.
That's right.
So this is, the feds are stepping in to fill that gap with aid policies, but a lot of this is still the competition for the state money for other competing priorities.
No, so the states made tough choices during the Great Recession, but our disappointment is that they have not made equally positive choices as the economy has grown. Now we're trying to help out. The president has created income-based repayment plans that allow every direct loan borrower to cap their payments at 10% of discretionary income. That ought to help a lot for people who are at the beginning of their careers, who may be in between jobs, and we hope that more and more borrowers will take advantage of those programs on the back end.
We have a user question. We have an audience question. I want to paraphrase it a little bit. So we hear a lot about competitiveness, where we once were, we're not quite. We want to back up there. What's it going to take to jump a couple of notches? And I know the administration says we're on that path. In terms of investments, in terms of commitments, in terms of increasing the number of college graduates, and a lot of the effort focused on data and outcomes and financial aid and other things. Are there one or two levers that would have a huge impact in terms of moving those things forward?
Sure, it's a great question, and we know that in order to move from 12th in the world back to first in the world, which is where we would all like to be, that being in the production of post-secondary degrees and certificates and credentials, we know we have to do things differently. We have to innovate. We can't simply accept the same institutions to be producing more graduates over time. We need the same way. We need to innovate. It's one of the things that's so striking about being here this week is that this is a group of people who in one way or another are committed to creating those innovations that will create shorter pathways to degrees for students, less expensive pathways to degrees for students, opportunities for institutions to do the kinds of things, Casey, that you and I have been talking about, to use the data, use the technology to make degree paths more seamless and more easily navigable for students. We think that big data, innovative delivery of instruction, new assessments that are embedded in the activities themselves, and an appreciation for the more modularization of education so that it doesn't take a complete 4-year package living in a residential liberal arts college to get a bachelor's degree. We believe that the combination of those, again, and systemic approach to those will be the keys to moving up several notches.
I want to come back to the 270 days. Again, you've got the app. Sorry? I don't know if you want them or not, but if you got another, if you were offered another, if you had another 270 days, something that you would add to the current list of priorities, a new initiative, an additional investment or extra effort on this particular thing?
Yeah. So I think that we've just begun to assemble the pieces for attacking the completion agenda.
Okay.
And I think if we could take this game into overtime, that's where I would focus my attention.
All right. One last question. We are at the Innovation Conference. You talked about the excitement of being here. Given your past, again, I'm college president, dean, some of the other things that you have done over your career, and now your role as a public official, what's the importance of this conference? Why does this matter beyond the folks that are gathered here in the sunshine in San Diego?
So I think a couple things. I think we began by talking about the education system as a system and the importance of addressing it as a system. The entrepreneurship sector, the innovation sector, is a nascent ecosystem. And one of the problems we have in education is a problem of scale. There are lots of innovations going on at the campus level, lots of entrepreneurs working on things. It's very difficult to get them to move up from boutique-y, even effective boutique-y programs or interventions to something much more systemic. What this conference provides is an opportunity for people to see the whole landscape, to see the ecosystem in action. for connections to be made, for opportunities to be built, for people to combine their energies in ways that will affect more and more students.
Ted, Undersecretary Mitchell, thank you very much for joining us. It's
Casey,
great to see you. It's great to be in the box with you. Thank you for the conversation.
Thank you.
Good.
Thanks.
All right, we will be right back. Joining me in a moment will be Wendy Leduc from eSchool Media. We're going to sort of talk about what's going on the floor and in the hallways, a little bit of the conference buzz.